storm was a ravenous thing, a creature of wind and water that sought to devour the Cornish coast. It clawed at the carriage with invisible talons, and inside, the woman who called herself Ina huddled in a threadbare cloak, a name she had plucked from the fog in her own mind. It was a name as thin as the blanket covering her, offering no warmth, no history. She knew only two things with visceral certainty: the chilling echo of a man's voice, sharp and cruel as broken glass, and the desperate primal need to run. The lurch was sudden and violent, a crack like a bone snapping, the shriek of tortured wood, and then the world became a maelstrom of blackness and tumbling chaos. Her final coherent thought was of the jagged rocks she had seen from the window, waiting like teeth in the churning sea below. When consciousness returned, it was not to the crashing of waves, but to the crackling of a fire. The scent of lavender and beeswax replaced the brine and decay of the storm. She was in a bed, a vast four-poster carved with grim-faced gargoyles, beneath a counterpane so heavy it felt like a layer of earth. A woman with a face like a weathered map, her hair pulled into a severe gray knot, was wringing out a cloth in a basin. "You're awake," the woman stated, her voice devoid of surprise. "The master found you on the cliff path. The carriage went over. You were thrown clear. A miracle, some might say." She dabbed Ina's forehead with the cool cloth. "I am Mrs. Gable, housekeeper of Greystone Manor." Ina tried to speak, but her throat was raw. "Where?" "Cornwall," Mrs. Gable supplied. "And you are the guest of His Grace, the Duke of Greystone." A duke. The word sent a tremor of an unfamiliar fear through her. She pushed herself up, her head throbbing in protest. The room was immense, paneled in dark wood that seemed to drink the firelight. The windows were tall and narrow, like arrow slits in a fortress, and through them, a bruised twilight sky was visible. This was a place of power, of isolation. The door opened and the master of the house entered. He was not what she expected. He was tall and lean, with an academic's stoop to his shoulders. His face was all sharp angles and intelligent inquiry, his eyes the cool, dispassionate gray of the slate cliffs outside. He moved not with the languid entitlement of an aristocrat, but with the focused purpose of a man who measures the world in observable facts. He held a small chipped rock in his hand, turning it over and over with long, deft fingers. "You are fortunate, madam," he said, his voice as crisp and precise as the snap of flint. The fall could have been conclusive. He stopped a few feet from the bed, assessing her not as a person, but as a problem, a geological anomaly that had appeared on his land. "You have a name?" "Ina," she whispered. It felt flimsy, a lie even to herself. "Ina," he repeated, testing the sound. "No surname? No memory of your destination? Your point of origin?" She shook her head, a fresh wave of dizziness washing over her. "There is a fog and a voice. Nothing more." The Duke Alastair regarded her for a long moment. He was a man of science, a geologist of some renown. He believed in strata, in evidence, in the slow, logical accretion of time. This woman, this Ina, was a fracture in his ordered world, a human enigma without provenance. "Rest," he commanded, his tone softening by a fraction of a degree. "Mrs. Gable will see to your needs. We will discuss your situation when you have recovered your strength." He turned and left as abruptly as he had entered, the small rock still turning in his hand. The days that followed were a quiet torment. Ina's body healed, but her mind remained a blank slate, haunted by phantom feelings of terror and a profound aching sorrow. She had no past, which meant she had no future. Mrs. Gable treated her with a guarded propriety, feeding her, clothing her in borrowed gowns that were impeccably made, but decades out of fashion. The housekeeper's kindness was tempered by a deep well of suspicion. A woman with no name, found on the Duke's land? In this isolated part of the country, such things were the seed of scandal. Ina found a strange solace in the manor's neglected conservatory. It was a glass cathedral of rust and decay, but within it, life stubbornly persisted. She found herself recognizing plants, not by name, but by instinct. She knew which soil a struggling fern required, how to prune a leggy geranium to encourage new growth, which herbs to crush to make a soothing poultice for the cut on her arm. Her hands seemed to remember a language her mind had forgotten. Alistair found her there one afternoon, her borrowed dress smudged with dirt, her hands carefully repotting a rare orchid that his late mother had cherished. He watched from the doorway, unseen, as she worked with a focused, knowledgeable grace. The way she handled the delicate roots was not the fumbling of an amateur, but the practice of an expert. Another fact that did not fit. The inevitable confrontation came a week later, precipitated by a visit from the local vicar, a man whose piety was matched only by his insatiable curiosity. He had heard whispers in the village of a mysterious woman being sheltered at the great house. His questions were couched in clerical concern, but their intent was sharp and probing. That evening, Alistair summoned Ina to his study. It was the heart of his world, a room dominated not by portraits of ancestors, but by glass-fronted cabinets filled with geological specimens. Maps of strata covered the walls. The air smelled of old paper and stone dust. "The vicar's visit has made your position untenable, madam," he began, foregoing any preamble. He stood by the fire, his back to her. "The village thrives on gossip. A woman of unknown origins, living under my roof, unchaperoned. The conclusions they will draw are as predictable as they are damaging. Not to me, I care little for their opinions, but to you. You will be branded, ruined." Ina wrapped her arms around herself. Ruined? She felt she already was. What more was there to lose? He turned to face her, his gray eyes analytical. "I see only one logical solution. It is a fiction, a distasteful one, I grant you, but it will provide you with a shield of sorts. It will give you a name, a role, a reason for being here that will, if not satisfy their curiosity, at least silence the most venomous tongues." He paused and the silence stretched, thick with the unsaid. "From this day forward, you are no longer the mysterious Ina. You are Mrs. Gray, a widow of modest means whom I have engaged as my companion." The word hung in the air, ugly and insinuating. Ina flinched as if struck. A companion, a mistress. It was a role defined by shame, a transaction of the flesh. Was this the price of his rescue? What would you do, I wonder, if you were in her place? No memory, no name, no allies, and offered a sanctuary that came with such a cost? "You will be treated with respect within these walls," he continued, either not noticing or not caring about her reaction. "Your duties will be non-existent. You will simply be Mrs. Gray. It is a lie, but it is a coherent one. It is a story they can understand." She looked at this cold, logical man who offered her a cloak of disgrace as if it were a scientific instrument designed to solve a social problem. He wasn't being cruel, he was being practical. And in her desolate, anchorless world, practicality was a form of kindness. She had no other options. To be cast out was to face a world she did not know, with dangers she could only feel in the marrow of her bones. I understand," she whispered, the words tasting of ash. "Good," he said, turning his attention to a piece of quartz on his desk. The matter concluded. "Mrs. Gable will be informed of your new status." And so, Ina died, and Mrs. Eleanor Gray was born in a dusty study on the Cornish coast. She had been given a name and a place, but in exchange, she had been handed a mask of shame to wear. As she walked back to her cavernous room, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just agreed to become a ghost of a different sort, haunting the halls of Greystone Manor, a fiction created by a man who saw the world not in shades of emotion, but in the stark, cold clarity of stone. Life as Mrs. Gray settled into a rhythm as monotonous and predictable as the tides. She and the Duke took their evening meals together in a dining hall vast enough to host a royal banquet. Their conversation was a stilted affair, an exchange of carefully curated neutralities. He would speak of mineralogy, of the curious crystalline structures he had found in a new seam of granite. She would talk of the slow resurrection of the conservatory, of the stubborn blooming of a forgotten rosebush. They orbited each other like two celestial bodies held in place by a gravity of convenience, never touching, never truly connecting. Yet connection began to form in the spaces between their words. Ina, she still thought of herself as Ina, discovered that Alistair's coldness was not an absence of feeling, but a shield for a mind that operated on a different plane. He was not unkind. He was simply elsewhere, his thoughts tracing geological time, his passions reserved for the silent stories told by rocks. She began to see the world through his eyes, the history in a pebble, the violence in a cliff face, the slow, inexorable dance of pressure and time. In turn, he began to notice her. He would find a small, perfect fossil left on his desk, a silent offering. He would come to the conservatory to find a rare botanical illustration she had found in a dusty tome, left open for him to see. She began to catalog his vast, disorganized library, her neat, elegant script bringing order to his chaos. He found her intellect a surprise, then a pleasure. "Your penmanship is remarkable, Mrs. Gray," he commented one evening, examining a list she had made. "As is your grasp of Latin nomenclature." A flicker of memory, sharp and unwelcome, pierced the fog. A tutor, his face severe, rapping her knuckles with a ruler. "A duchess must have a hand as steady as her resolve, Seraphina." Seraphina. The name echoed in the hollows of her mind, strange and yet achingly familiar. She pressed her fingers to her temples, a wave of nausea sweeping over her. "Are you unwell?" Alistair asked, a flicker of genuine concern in his analytical gaze. "A headache, Your Grace." "Nothing more," she lied, forcing the name back into the darkness. It was a dangerous name. It felt connected to the cruel voice that haunted her dreams. She was Mrs. Gray. Mrs. Gray was safe. She began to have more of these flashes, these jagged shards of a life she couldn't grasp. The feel of heavy silk against her skin, the scent of a man's cologne, cloying and possessive, the glint of a signet ring on a fist raised in anger. She pieced them together into a narrative of her own making. She must have been a governess or a lady's companion, trapped in a house with a cruel master. She must have fled his abuse. It was a story that made sense of her fear, a story that fit the lowly station she now occupied. It was a story that was profoundly wrong. The outside world intruded upon their isolation in the form of Lord Beckworth, a fellow of the Royal Geological Society and one of Alistair's few acquaintances. Beckworth was Alistair's opposite in every way. Flamboyant, garrulous, a man who collected gossip as avidly as Alistair collected stones. He arrived in a flurry of velvet and opinions, his eyes immediately lighting upon Ina as she arranged flowers in the great hall. His gaze was sharp, assessing, and for a terrifying moment, Ina was certain he recognized her. "Alistair, you rogue," he boomed at dinner that night, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. "Keeping secrets in this dreary pile of rocks. And such a lovely secret she is." He winked at Ina, who felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. Alistair's expression was glacial. "Mrs. Gray is my companion, Beckworth, and my guest. You will treat her with respect." Of course," Beckworth said, waving a dismissive hand. He then launched into a breathless chronicle of London society's latest scandals. Ornament in the most delicious whisper of all concerns, the Duke of Blackwood. Utter monster, they say. Keeps his estate north of here in the most frightful seclusion. Well, it seems his Duchess, the beautiful Seraphina, didn't die of a wasting sickness last year as he claimed. Ina's blood ran cold. The name, Seraphina. "Oh yes," Beckworth continued, leaning forward conspiratorially. "The story is that she tried to flee his cruelty and he's been hunting for her ever since. Put it about that she died to save face. A man of immense pride, Marcus Blackwood, and immense cruelty. I saw a portrait of her once, at a charity auction, a true diamond of the first water, haunting eyes." He pulled a small enameled case from his waistcoat. "In fact, I bought the miniature. Couldn't resist a tragic beauty." He snapped it open and slid it across the polished table toward Alistair. "See for yourself." Time seemed to slow. Alistair picked up the miniature. His eyes, usually so calm and measured, widened almost imperceptibly. He looked from the painted face to the living one at the other end of the table. He saw the same curve of the jaw, the same wide-set eyes the color of twilight, the same aristocratic arch of the brow. He saw the woman he knew as Ina, as Mrs. Gray, staring back at him from a portrait of a duchess believed to be dead. The silence was a living thing. Beckworth, for once, seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere and fell quiet. Alistair's gaze met Ina's across the vast expanse of mahogany. The warmth that had begun to kindle between them over weeks of quiet companionship was extinguished in an instant, replaced by the cold, hard shock of betrayal. He didn't speak, but his eyes asked a single, devastating question. "Who are you?" The miniature lay on the table between them, a tiny, perfect accusation. Ina stared at the face in the portrait, her face, and the fog in her mind ripped apart. A torrent of memories flooded in, not as flashes, but as a tidal wave of clarity. Marcus, her husband, the Duke of Blackwood, his study, the doors locked, his voice not just cruel but silken with menace, the isolation, the slow, methodical stripping away of her freedom, her friends, her very identity, until he was the only person she saw, his voice the only one she heard. He hadn't beaten her body, he had caged her soul, and when she had finally found the courage to escape, he had simply erased her, declaring her dead to a world that had already forgotten her. The room tilted. The faces of Alistair and Beckworth swam before her eyes. The air grew thick, unbreathable. She heard a small, strangled sound and realized it had come from her own throat. She pushed her chair back, a desperate need to flee overwhelming her. She had to run. Marcus would find her. He always found her. She stumbled from the dining hall, her breath coming in ragged sobs, and fled to the only place she felt safe, the conservatory. She collapsed onto a stone bench amidst the ferns and orchids, wrapping her arms around herself as the violent memories crashed over her. She was not Mrs. Grey. She was not Ina. She was Seraphina, Duchess of Blackwood, a woman legally dead, hunted by a husband the world believed to be a widower. The conservatory door creaked open. It was Alistair. He held the miniature in his hand. He didn't speak, just stood there, his face an unreadable mask of stone. The man of science had been presented with an impossible fact, a living ghost. The logical framework of his world had been shattered by the woman he had rescued. If you were Alistair, a man who prizes logic and evidence above all, would you believe her story now? Or would the deception, however necessary, forever poison your trust? "It is true then," he said at last. His voice was flat, stripped of all emotion. "You are the Duchess of Blackwood." She could only nod, tears streaming down her face. "He told everyone I was dead." "And you told me you were Ina," he countered, the words sharp as flint. "You allowed me to create a fiction for you, while you were living a far more elaborate one of your own. Every conversation, every moment, it was all predicated on a lie." "I didn't remember," she cried, the words torn from her. "Not until tonight. I knew I was running from something terrible, but I didn't know what. I didn't know who I was." He studied her, his geologist's eyes searching for the truth in the strata of her distress. But the foundation had been compromised. He had allowed this woman into his house, into the quiet, ordered sanctuary of his life. He had begun to feel something for her, an intellectual respect that was slowly, frighteningly, turning into something more. And it had all been built on sand. He turned and walked away without another word, leaving her alone with her newly recovered, terrifying identity. The days that followed were a cold hell. Alistair retreated behind a wall of impenetrable formality. He was once again the remote Duke of Greystone, and she was the convenient Mrs. Grey. But now the fiction was laced with the poison of his knowledge. Their silent dinners were unbearable, each moment fraught with accusation. Seraphina lived in a state of constant terror. Now that she knew who she was, she knew who was looking for her. Marcus would not be content with her simply disappearing. His pride would demand her return. His power was immense, his reach long. Greystone Manor, once a fortress, now felt like a cage. Her fears were realized a week later. She had taken to walking along the most secluded paths of the estate, trying to find a moment's peace. As she rounded a bend near the overgrown folly, a man stepped from the shadows of the yews. He was tall and broad, with a face that looked as if it had been crudely carved from wood. His eyes were small and devoid of pity. She recognized him instantly. Fletcher, her husband's estate manager, his enforcer. "Your Grace," Fletcher said, his voice a low growl. He sketched a mocking bow. "The Duke has been most distraught by your absence. He is eager for your return." Seraphina's heart hammered against her ribs. "I am not going back." Fletcher smiled, a chilling expression that did not reach his eyes. I'm afraid you mistake the nature of the request. It is not a request. He lunged for her. Seraphina screamed and scrambled backward, her mind racing. This was it. The moment she had been running from. But she was not the same broken thing who had fled Blackwood Manor. She had spent weeks in this garden. She knew its secrets. As Fletcher reached for her arm, she grabbed a nearby terracotta pot, a night-blooming cereus she had been nursing back to health, and smashed it against the stone wall beside him. The pot shattered, and the thick, thorny stem of the cactus raked across the back of his hand. He roared in pain and fury, momentarily distracted. It was the only opening she needed. She darted past him, not toward the house, but deeper into the overgrown part of the garden, toward the cliff edge. She knew this path. Alistair had shown it to her, pointing out the unique fossil-bearing shale formations. It was treacherous, but there was a small, hidden turnoff, a game trail that led back toward the manor's west wing. Fletcher, bellowing curses, crashed after her through the undergrowth. He was bigger, but she was faster, fueled by terror and adrenaline. The roar of the sea grew louder. She could feel his presence just behind her, his heavy footsteps shaking the ground. She reached the turnoff, a nearly invisible break in the foliage, and threw herself into it, scraping her arms on thorns. Fletcher, expecting her to run straight for the cliff, thundered past. She didn't stop. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs felt like lead, bursting from the woods and stumbling across the wide, manicured lawn in full view of the house. And there, standing on the terrace, was Alistair. He had seen the whole thing. He was moving before she even registered his presence, striding toward the woods from which Fletcher was now emerging, looking enraged and bewildered. The two men met on the lawn, a stark contrast. Alistair, lean and elegant in his tailored coat, his face a mask of cold fury. Fletcher, brutish and disheveled, his hand bleeding from the cactus thorns. "You are trespassing on my land," Alistair said, his voice dangerously quiet. Fletcher sneered. "I am here on business for the Duke of Blackwood. That woman is his wife. She is coming with me." "That woman," Alistair replied, taking a deliberate step forward to place himself between Fletcher and Seraphina, "is under my protection. She is not going anywhere. You, however, will leave now. Before I have my gamekeepers escort you to the county line and inform the magistrate of your assault on a guest in my home." Fletcher hesitated. He was a man who understood violence and brute force. He did not understand this cold intellectual authority, but he understood power. And the Duke of Greystone, for all his reclusive ways, had power. He was the law in this part of Cornwall. With a final venomous glare at Seraphina, Fletcher turned and stalked away. Seraphina stood on the lawn, shaking uncontrollably, watching him go. The immediate danger had passed, but the larger one remained. She turned to look at Alistair. He was no longer the remote, judgmental Duke. In his eyes, she saw not just anger at the intrusion, but a fierce, protective fire she had never seen before. He had seen her terror, he had seen her fight, and he had defended her. "Come inside," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. He walked to her side, and though he did not touch her, she felt the shield of his presence settle around her. "You will tell me everything, not as Mrs. Grey, not as Ina, as Seraphina, and this time I will listen." The great hall was dark and silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock that measured out the seconds of their new, fragile truce. Seraphina, wrapped in a blanket by the fire, told him everything. She spoke of her marriage to Marcus, a man adored by society for his charm, but a monster in private. She described the suffocating isolation of Blackwood Manor, the gaslighting, the psychological torment, the way he had delighted in controlling her every move, her every thought. She told him of her escape, her desperate flight, and the blank terror of her amnesia. Alistair listened without interruption. The story was fantastical, gothic, the stuff of penny dreadfuls, and yet he had seen Fletcher. He had seen the terror in Seraphina's eyes, a terror too profound to be feigned. The evidence was before him, not in stone, but in flesh and blood. And for the first time in his life, Alistair chose to trust something other than empirical data. He chose to trust her. "He will not let this go," Alistair said when she had finished, his voice grim. A man like that, his pride is everything. He declared you dead. For you to reappear would expose him as a liar and a brute. He will stop at nothing to silence you or drag you back. Then what can I do? Serafina whispered, the hopelessness of her situation crashing down on her. The law will not help me. I am his wife. Legally, I am his property. And legally, I do not exist. Alistair began to pace the length of the hall, his mind working. This was no longer a social inconvenience. It was a strategic problem. We cannot fight him on his terms. We cannot use the law as it stands. We must change the battlefield. He stopped and looked at her, his eyes alight with a cold, intellectual fire. We cannot prove your story without corroboration. But what if we could prove his lie? The plan was audacious, dangerous, and hinged entirely on the one person Alistair knew who moved in the same circles as Marcus Blackwood. Lord Beckworth, Alistair said. Serafina recoiled. The gossip? He will turn it into a parlor story. Precisely, Alistair countered. Blackwood's greatest weapon is his reputation and the privacy his seclusion affords him. Beckworth's greatest weapon is gossip. We will use it to shine a light into his dark corners. But first we need proof. Something undeniable that you are who you say you are, and that he knowingly lied about your death. He thought for a moment. Was there anyone on your staff at Blackwood Manor? Someone who was loyal to you? Someone who witnessed his cruelty? Serafina's mind raced. Most of the staff had been terrified of Marcus, but there was one. Mrs. Finch, she breathed. My lady's maid. She was with me for years before he dismissed her without cause. He said she was a bad influence. She saw everything. Where is she now? Her family lives in a village near Exeter. I think I remember the name. Oakhaven. Then that is where we begin, Alistair declared. We need her testimony, and we need something else, something only you would know, some detail about your life or your family that can be verified independently. Serafina thought of her family, the Ashworths. Her father had been a diplomat. Before he passed, my father brokered a private treaty with a minor German principality. The documents were sealed by the crown, but a copy of the preliminary accord, in my father's own hand, was kept in a secret compartment in the Blackwood Library. Marcus doesn't know of it. It bears my father's seal and mine as a witness. Alistair's eyes gleamed. A physical document. Excellent. Proof of your identity and access to secrets Blackwood himself does not possess. He looked at her, his expression a mixture of strategic admiration and something softer, more personal. You are more resourceful than you know, Your Grace. The journey to Exeter was made in secret in a plain, unmarked carriage. The transition from hunted woman to co-conspirator had forged a new intimacy between them. They spoke for hours, not of minerals or flowers, but of strategy, of fear, of the future. For Serafina, it was the first time she had felt like a partner rather than a possession. Finding Mrs. Finch was not difficult. The elderly woman lived in a small, tidy cottage, and when she saw Serafina on her doorstep, she burst into tears and pulled her into a fierce embrace. Her testimony was damning. She spoke of the Duke's rages, of the locked doors, of the day Serafina's favorite dog had vanished after displeasing the Duke. She agreed without hesitation to sign a formal affidavit. The second part of their plan was far more dangerous. They needed the document from the Blackwood Library. It's impossible, Serafina said, as they planned in a private room at an Exeter inn. The manor is a fortress. Every fortress has a weakness, Alistair countered. He unrolled a survey map, the paper crackling in the charged silence of the room. I have studied the geology of this entire region. According to these old charts, Blackwood Manor was built over a series of limestone caves. There are mentions of a smuggler's tunnel, long disused, that connected the cellars to a small cove north of the main headland. It was a thread of hope woven from rock and shadow, a wild, improbable gamble. Yet it was the only one they had. As they bent over the map, his long scientific finger tracing the path of least resistance through the earth, a new and profound intimacy took root between them. Here was Alistair, the Duke of Greystone, a man of logic and empirical fact, preparing to risk his name, his freedom, and his life to crawl through the dark for her. In that moment, Seraphina's respect, an emotion she had already felt in abundance, underwent a seismic shift, deepening into something she dared not name but felt in the very marrow of her bones. 2 nights later, under a sliver of a moon that offered more shadow than light, they made their move. The cove was a jagged mouth of rock, and the tunnel entrance, hidden behind a thick tapestry of ivy, was a cold, damp throat breathing the scent of brine and ancient decay. Alistair went first, holding the hooded lantern aloft. The narrow passage was claustrophobic, the walls slick with moisture. He moved with a quiet confidence, his voice a low murmur as he pointed out calcite formations and fossiliferous limestone. His academic nature a strange, calming counterpoint to the thundering of Seraphina's heart. He was mapping the darkness, taming it with knowledge, and she followed in his wake, her terror giving way to a fierce, exhilarating resolve. They emerged precisely as the chart predicted, behind a row of dust-shrouded wine racks in the cavernous cellar. From there, Seraphina became the guide. She led them through the sleeping belly of the house, a ghost returned to her own haunting grounds. Every shadow was a memory, every creak of a floorboard an echo of her former fear. Yet, with Alistair at her side, the fear was different. Not the paralyzing dread of a victim, but the sharp, focused anxiety of a predator. The library was unchanged, a mausoleum of leather and polished wood, magnificent and suffocating. The air was thick with the scent of Marcus's cigars, a smell that made Seraphina's stomach clench. She moved without hesitation to the far wall, her fingers tracing the spines of unread classics until they found the false panel. A click, a soft groan of well-oiled hinges, and the secret compartment was revealed. Inside, the slim portfolio lay pristine on its velvet bed. Her hands, slick with a nervous sweat, trembled as she took it. It was then that a floorboard creaked in the great hall. They froze, every muscle tensed. The sound was followed by the soft, menacing padding of large paws and a low whine. The wolfhounds. A sliver of light bloomed beneath the library door, slicing through the darkness. "He is coming," Seraphina mouthed, the words a silent scream. There was no escape. Alistair's reaction was instantaneous. He extinguished the lantern, plunging them into an abyss of absolute black. He pulled her with him, not away from the door, but toward the immense bay window, pressing them deep into the suffocating folds of the heavy velvet curtains. His body was a solid, warm shield in front of hers. In the disorienting dark, his hand found hers, his grip a silent promise. They stood as still as the stone gargoyles on Greystone's roof, their breathing suspended as the brass handle on the library door turned with agonizing slowness. The door swung inward, casting a long, distorted rectangle of candlelight onto the Persian rug. Marcus entered, a spectral figure in a silk dressing gown, a glass of brandy in one hand. The two wolfhounds flanked him, their massive heads low, sniffing the air with uneasy growls. "Quiet, you fools," Marcus murmured, his voice the same silken caress that had once soothed her and then tormented her. He wasn't looking for anyone. He was simply restless, a king surveying his silent domain. He drifted to the fireplace, staring into the cold embers. Seraphina could feel Alistair's heartbeat, a steady, powerful rhythm against her back. She focused on it, anchoring herself to it as Marcus began to pace. He moved closer to the window, so close she could smell the brandy on his breath. One of the hounds whined again, its nose pointed directly at the curtains. Marcus stopped. He reached out a hand, his signet ring glinting in the candlelight, and ran his fingers along the very velvet that concealed them. It was a casual, proprietary gesture, the touch of a man who owned everything in the room. Seraphina felt a tremor run through her, a sob of pure terror trapped in her throat. Alistair's grip tightened on her hand, a silent command to remain still. For an eternity that stretched across seconds, Marcus stood there. Then with a sigh of dissatisfaction, he turned away. "It's nothing, a draft. This whole damned house is full of ghosts." He finished his brandy, placed the glass on the mantelpiece, and strode from the room, the dogs padding silently after him. The door clicked shut, and they were once again enveloped in absolute darkness. They didn't move for a long time, listening to his footsteps recede up the grand staircase. Only when the house had fallen completely silent did Alistair finally release a breath he seemed to have been holding since Marcus entered. He led her from behind the curtain, their escape a frantic, silent scramble back through the house and into the cold, clean air of the tunnel. They didn't speak until they were back in the cove, the tang of salt on their lips, the portfolio clutched in Seraphina's hand like a sacred text. There, under the cold, unpitying stars, she finally collapsed against him, not in fear, but in the shuddering, cathartic release of a battle survived. The final confrontation did not happen in the shadows, but under the harsh, scrutinizing light of day, within the paneled walls of Sir Edwin Vance's London law offices. Sir Edwin was the soul of discretion, a man whose silence was as valuable as his counsel. Lord Beckworth, using his considerable social leverage, had arranged the meeting on the pretext of an urgent matter concerning the Blackwood estate's northern boundary, which abutted Greystone land. Marcus arrived in a cloud of bespoke tailoring and simmering impatience. He saw Seraphina seated beside Alistair and his composure fractured. For a heartbeat, the mask of the charming, bereaved Duke fell away, revealing a glimpse of the predator within. A flash of incandescent rage in his eyes before it was ruthlessly suppressed. "Sir Edwin," he began, his voice a low, dangerous purr, as he ignored Seraphina completely. "I was told this was a matter of some urgency. I fail to see how that involves a provincial duke and this unfortunate woman he has seen fit to parade about town. Her resemblance to my late beloved wife is a cruel coincidence I prefer not to endure." This was his strategy, to deny her existence, to paint her as an impostor, a madwoman. Alistair met his gaze with the cool, dispassionate stare of a scientist observing a specimen. He said nothing. He simply placed the slim portfolio on the polished mahogany desk. "This is a preliminary accord between the late Earl of Ashworth and the Principality of Hesse-Darmstadt. It was witnessed by his daughter. The seals are intact. As the document was stored within the Blackwood Library, I am certain you will have no trouble verifying its authenticity, Your Grace." Marcus's jaw tightened. He had not known of its existence. It was a blow, but not a fatal one. Next came Mrs. Finch's sworn affidavit. As Sir Edwin read the maid's stark, detailed account of cruelty and psychological abuse, Marcus's face became a mask of contempt. "The pathetic fantasies of a dismissed servant," he scoffed, "hardly credible." It was then that Seraphina spoke, and her voice, though quiet, cut through the room's tense atmosphere like a shard of glass. "Is the testimony of Mr. Abernathy of Bond Street also a fantasy?" Marcus froze. Lord Beckworth, who had been sitting quietly in the corner like a spectator at the opera, leaned forward. "We took the liberty of speaking with Mr. Abernathy," he said with relish. "The jeweler. He provided us with his ledger. It shows a commission placed by you, Your Grace, for a rather elaborate diamond mourning brooch in memory of your wife. An entry dated 6 weeks before her reported demise. It would seem your grief was prescient." The silence that followed was absolute. This was not an accusation of cruelty, which could be debated. This was cold, documented proof of premeditation, of the lie. Sir Edwin cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud. "Your Grace," the solicitor said, his voice grave, "an inquiry into the fraudulent certification of a death, combined with these other testimonies. The scandal would be insurmountable. The Crown would have no choice but to act. It would mean forfeiture of the title, sequestration of all properties. It would mean a trial. It would mean ruin." Marcus stared, not at Alistair, but at Seraphina. He was trapped, undone not by a grand assault, but by a meticulous collection of truths. He saw her then, not as a broken possession, but as the architect of his downfall. His handsome face twisted into a snarl of pure hatred. "What is it you want?" he spat. Seraphina met his gaze, and for the first time in her life, she felt no fear of him. The power had shifted. "I want my life," she said, her voice ringing with the clarity of hard-won steel. "An immediate annulment, granted on the grounds of your documented cruelty and fraud. A public statement from you, explaining that I was never deceased, but had been sequestered in a private Swiss clinic for a severe nervous condition, from which I am now recovered. And you will cede control of my dowry lands, the Ashworth estate, back to me in perpetuity. Then you will remove yourself to the continent. You will never set foot in England again." It was not a negotiation. It was a decree. He looked from her face to Alistair's, to Beckworth's, to the damning papers on the desk. He was caged. With a hand that trembled with suppressed violence, he took the pen Sir Edwin offered and signed away his power, his wife, and his life as he knew it. He did not look at her as he left the room, a wraith of a man whose world had just collapsed into dust. The return to Greystone was not a victory parade, but a quiet, contemplative journey. Serafina was free, but the phantom limbs of her trauma remained. For weeks, she would wake from nightmares, her heart pounding, the scent of Marcus's cigars in her nostrils. But each time, she would find herself not in the oppressive darkness of Blackwood Manor, but in the vast, safe bedchamber at Greystone, the sound of the sea a gentle lullaby. Alistair never pressed, never pried. He simply left a cup of chamomile tea by her door in the mornings and sought her out in the conservatory in the afternoons, where she was slowly, methodically, bringing the neglected orchids back to vibrant life. The conservatory became her sanctuary and his, a place where they worked side by side in a comfortable silence, repotting, pruning, nurturing growth. He was giving her what she had never had, the time and space to heal. One cool autumn evening, he found her in the library, the room where they had once hidden in terror, now a shared space of intellectual companionship. She was poring over a botanical atlas, her brow furrowed in concentration. He didn't speak, but simply sat across from her, cleaning and cataloging a tray of trilobite fossils. The only sounds were the rustle of pages and the soft scrape of his brush on stone. "I have been thinking," he said at last, breaking the comfortable silence. He set down a fossil, looking at her with an unnerving directness. "About strata, about the layers of time. My life before you arrived was a single predictable layer of sedimentary rock. Orderly, logical, unchanging." He paused and she looked up, her heart giving a strange, uncertain lurch. "You were an igneous intrusion," he continued, a faint, rare smile touching his lips. "Violent, chaotic, shattering the order of things. By all geological principles, you should have been a catastrophe. And you were." He met her eyes, his own gray gaze startlingly intense. "You were the most wonderful catastrophe of my life, Serafina. You broke my world open and let the light in." He stood and walked around the table to her, taking the heavy atlas from her hands and setting it aside. "I have no interest in returning to an orderly, logical, and unchanging existence. This chaos, this partnership, I find I am remarkably suited to it." He took her hands, his touch warm and firm. "I am not asking you to be my Duchess. I am not offering you a new title or a new cage, however gilded. I am asking if you, Serafina Ashworth, would be willing to build a new life here, with me, Alistair, as my wife, as my partner, as my equal in all things." Tears welled in her eyes, not of sorrow or fear, but of a profound, soul-deep relief. He was not rescuing a duchess. He was choosing a woman. He was choosing her. "Alistair," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "I have spent my life as property. You are the first person to see me as a person." She rose, her hand still in his. "To build a life with you would not be a duty. It would be a privilege." A year later, the Duchess of Greystone stood beside her husband, a sheaf of architectural drawings spread across a table on the terrace. The plans were not for a new ballroom, but for a new school in the village. Their life together had become a quiet revolution, a testament to shared purpose. "With a proper heritage stewardship program for the forests, we can supply the timber sustainably," Alistair remarked, pointing to a notation. "It will build community trust to see the estate's resources used for the common good, not just for profit." Serafina nodded, tapping a finger on the drawing. "And complete financial transparency will show everyone where the money's going. I want to guarantee education access for every child, especially the girls. We can start a scholarship fund for those wishing to continue their studies." Alistair placed his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "It is all connected," he said, his voice a low hum against her ear. "Family wellness begins with opportunity and security. Theirs would be a philanthropic legacy defined by responsible governance. They would champion youth literacy and support local craftsmanship, ensuring a vibrant future built on the foundations of the past, creating a genuinely safe community. It was a future forged in the crucible of their shared ordeal, a partnership built not on convenience or title, but on the unshakable, hard-won truth that the strongest structures are built not of stone, but of trust, respect, and a love as resilient and profound as the earth beneath their feet.